One.
All right, guys. So we're going to take a quick look at imperialism, and we're going to focus specifically on Africa. I know I got a chance to introduce this, I think, in both classes. So the main theme we're going to look at is why and how European nations began to look towards Africa at the end of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th century. There's some clear, obvious, and simple answers, like a need for resources to further the quote unquote industrial revolution, ethnocentrism, all those sorts of things. And like most things that we study in history, it's going to be a combination, in many cases, of all of the above. All right, so in both classes, we introduced the idea that slavery itself had been abolished in most major industrialized countries. Africa itself is absolutely massive. We took a look at these maps in class and explained why flat, single dimension maps are actually totally lying to you. And we also talked about the idea about how most of Europe was disconnected to the inlands of Africa because of disease, fear of tribal warriors, all of the things that made it a daunting, big, unknown place were eventually the things that invited all those European nations in there for a sense of exploration, finding something new, pride, all of those ego things that go along with imperialism were ripe in Africa. Okay, so let's pick up here. So what initially sparked the interest across most of Europe was almost singly one man, Dr. David Livingstone. So you may have heard the phrase before, Dr. Livingstone, I presume, and this is that Livingstone. He was an abolitionist. In other words, he believed slavery was morally wrong, and he was looking to get rid of the slave trade. So he had a weird, logical way of doing that. And his plan was to find the source of the Nile in Africa. And when he would do that, he would become an international celebrity, and he could use his newfound platform to rail against the injustices of the slave trade. So in that effort, he traveled to Africa, crisscrossed back and forth across the continent. He acted as a missionary spreading Christianity, but he was also trying to bolster his evidence to make a claim against slavery. His three-word motto essentially became Christianity, commerce, and civilization. Sorry for the backwards quotation mark there. He was trying to spread those three C's throughout the continent, and we'll discuss those a little bit more in depth next week. So all of his work, all of his travels, all of his letters home eventually became legendary across most of mainland Europe and into UK. One man who was particularly captivated was King Leopold from Belgium. And he took these calls to Africa in two ways. Number one, on the surface, he basically said he was going to bring light to the barbarians of Africa. And number two, although this is unstated, it was a great financial opportunity for Belgium to tap into the unclaimed resources of Africa. So Livingstone focused most of his efforts in South Africa, believing that the source of the Nile was down here. All of his exploits in Africa were often reported back home, and like I said, he reached basically mythological fashion. He quote unquote discovered Victoria's Falls, among other things, and of course that's in quotation marks because others had been there well before that. And then finally, this is where the famous quote comes from. A journalist, I believe he actually might have been hired by King Leopold of Belgium to seek out, sorry about that, guys, to seek out Dr. Livingstone. And ultimately, he did find him living amongst an African tribe. And it's interesting to note that Livingstone, I think, had been missing for something like 3 or 4 years. So people just presumed he was dead. So when it was learned that he was still alive, it became an international exciting story that people really bought into. But beyond that, the scramble itself for Africa was really set off by King Leopold. So he set up exploration campaigns to go into what we would consider the Congo region today. And then soon thereafter, Great Britain, France, Germany, Spain, Portugal, and even America eventually would try to tap in and get their own claims to the area. So there's a couple reasons why. The first is the need for raw materials, like we talked about. The second is a little bit more complicated. This concept of ethnocentrism is the belief that your ethnicity is essentially greater more just, more verdant, whatever you want to say, than other ethnicities on the planet. And a lot of it can be traced back to the pseudoscience of social Darwinism. So we learned about Charles Darwin last chapter, and he essentially argued that the strongest species will survive because of their adaptations. Social Darwinists basically make the same claim, but they apply it to races. So we'll look at a couple of poems next week and some primary sources, specifically The White Man's Burden, that speaks towards that, although some historians might argue that it was in fact sarcastic. So there was advances in technology, better weapons, better medicine to deal with the diseases that were rampant in sub-Saharan Africa. And then, of course, Africa's political lack of unity made it an easy target. It was ripe in terms of tribalism. It wasn't just all one race, not just one ethnicity, not just one linguistic system that was used across the continent. There was very many different tribes. So that disunity actually made it an easier target for these European nations. So what they did, like civilized men will do, is they met between 1884 and 1885 in Berlin, and they essentially carved up the state, or excuse me, not the state, of course, the continent of Africa. And we looked at a political cartoon that kind of poked fun at this last week, where the German man was standing in the middle and he was carving up a cake of Africa for each of the men at the table. So a couple things to keep in mind. Of course, there was no African tribal leaders involved. There was no consideration for the groups that lived there already. In fact, many times the borders actually boxed in rival tribes or clans and led to further wars. And then finally, by the turn of the century, the only two countries left that were considered quote-unquote independent were Ethiopia, also known as Abyssinia. Pay special attention to that because that'll come up next chapter, and Liberia. And this is another place that Americans hold dear because this is a former colony, I believe, officially. But by the 1900s, it was an officially independent state. All right, this is just a recreation dramatically of what that meeting might have looked like. This is a breakdown on the map of all the different land claims. And this shows the basic land distribution. So the French ended up with the biggest land claims. If you look back on the map, you can see there. And then, of course, the British were close behind, and then these other less powerful countries had their own claims. But one of the things to consider, and we'll discuss this next week, is that atrocities ran rampant. Now, atrocities are anything that we might consider a tragedy, but that are carried out by man. So we'll talk about why these individuals had their hands chopped off in class, because it takes a little bit of explanation that needs to be done one-on-one. Missionaries did, in fact, carry some of the reports home to Europe of the malnutrition and all the things that, we cliche apply to Africa. Many of them are true. Famine, drought, when those things come, it can be devastating to the people that live there. But I alluded to this earlier on. One of the things that started to become evident was that some of the people traveling to Africa were essentially going to the slaves as opposed to bringing slaves to them. Now, it wasn't easy to reach domination. There was tribal resistance. The most famous of those tribes were the Zulus, with their fabled leader Shaka. According to some of the sources, he was supposed to be something like 7 feet tall with a 10-foot wingspan, and he would, kill people from 20 feet away with a spear, just swinging it around, not even having to throw it. They were unable to fight off the Europeans' most important invention, which they had access to, which of course was guns. And we'll pay a little bit more attention to that next week in class. But one of the examples I want you to focus on, and this is a metaphor that I used in class. If you've ever been to a birthday party and you smash open a piñata and everybody runs in, the Boer Wars is a good example of this. Essentially, this is where the British and the Dutch fought over land claims in South Africa. Now, the big thing to take away here is that this is one of the first modern wars, I would argue even before World War I, because the technology was quote-unquote modern. The real victims, of course, here were the native people. So they were forced into concentration camps. There was a serious lack of food. Malnutrition really devastated the population, and it was the source of many of the innocent deaths in this war. All right, so that's where I'll leave off for right now. I'll pick up the rest of the notes either in the next flipped lecture or we'll talk about them in class next week. So just leave off in the notes here and we'll pick up from there.